All right, here we are. Welcome back to Bookwave. Today we're looking at Jordan Peterson's 12 rules. Rules 9 and 10 today. Rule 9 being assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't. I'm your host, Scott, and today I'm joined by Pat Man and Will. What was the biggest impact this rule number 9 had on you reading through it?
I think for Rule 9, at the very least, my biggest takeaway, which I've probably taken away 1,000 times over, is that advice is pretty much useless. Shoving your ideology down someone else's throat when they really just need you to listen is garbage. I think I have a good quote here. Many people will tell you what their problem is and how they might go about fixing it if you just listened.
Yeah, this rule is something that is sort of in the sphere of how we spread our ideas and ideologues. And, we have this team versus team mentality. We have to, be with a certain crowd in order to win an argument or win a debate and everything. It's like the WWE of debate and everything. But we never take the mentality to just treat our discussions like we're treating progress in the world. We don't spend the time to actually fix a problem together, but instead, we always like to take the time to just say, I'm better than you. And if you don't listen to me, you're going to fail, or you are worthless. You are the problem. And that is toxic for all of us. And so we always have to take the time like Will said, we always have to take the time to listen and not use premature judgment. Judgment can work effectively at times, but the key is to not be judgmental personally. You don't want to attack somebody because of who they are or why they believe in it. You want to set judgment on, okay, is how effective is this idea going to be?
Your turn, Scott.
I was just going to say, and how effective it's going to be depends on the person. Like, if you're in a situation where you're giving someone advice, that might have been advice that worked for you, but for them, it's just providing a narrative or, criticizing them, like you said, just saying, well, this is how you do it, when you really weren't listening to what they were saying. You just said, oh, yeah, I know this problem, and this is how I fixed it, so that's how you need to fix it. You have to listen to the full situation and really actually give your own input instead of just saying, well, this is how I did it. This is how you need to do it too.
And what's interesting too is like the part about how they might even have the solution for their problem, and really what they're looking for
Yeah,
is
exactly.
sort of a sounding board. Like you could take any number of problems that a group of people have experienced and be either surprised or satisfied in the fact that all of these people address this problem differently. And for each person, a unique problem poses a different threat depending on where they're at in their life. Someone who is in a certain situation is going to react to a problem different from the way you might have. So you may have experienced the same problem, but it won't strike you the same way. And if you try and just give them advice on how you dealt with a problem, you're only going to be able to give them advice on the way it helped you. You can't help someone with their unique set of problems. You can offer a good discussion about different things that affected you and how you dealt with those in the past. You can share your experience, and perhaps that will help them get to a place where they want to go. But when you perceive what you think is their problem, you're just going to project your own interpretation of the problem onto it. And you need to just shut up and listen to them, because chances are, first of all, people can think. And if they have a chance to think, then secondly, they'll be able to come up with their own solutions.
Yeah, and you don't
Yeah,
you don't want to fill in any of the holes for them. You just want to ask them questions. So like one example that Jordan brings up in this book is so perfect because this Miss S character, who just shows up and says, I think I was raped 5 times. There's a lot you could say to that, but like you really have to know what they're talking about first. Like, what do you mean by rape? What do you mean by 5 times? What exactly is everything else in the situation that you haven't told me yet? I need more information before I can offer any kind of advice, if giving advice is the right thing to do in the end, because sometimes it isn't.
And absolutely, because like there's a certain degree of responsibility you shoulder. If you give someone advice and they take it and it gets them somewhere, and then they get to a place where they need more advice, they're going to come back to you and they're going to be dependent on you. And that's not actually autonomous life. If all they're doing is every time they have a problem asking for advice, you need to give them the opportunity to think for themselves. And ourselves need the opportunity to think for ourselves.
Yeah, and sometimes discussions can be spontaneous. You have to ask them to simplify it as much as they can so that you can move forward with the discussion. There's a quote here. He Peterson mentions Carl Rogers, and he mentions a quote that he says, "It's the great majority of us cannot listen. We find ourselves compelled to evaluate because listening is too dangerous. The first requirement is courage, and we do not always have it." And it goes back to how we should be willing to actually stand up and point out a problem or a scenario that's going on instead of just sitting back and letting it all happen. Because if we do, we risk the potential danger, if not catastrophic, outcome to occur. And
So
sometimes, I'm sorry, just to add on to it, sometimes people don't want to listen to advice. And if that's the case, then it's best to just let them be. And in the same way that when a person comes to you for help and becomes dependent on you and is not willing to think, when you offer them to actually just think for themselves, you also cannot push any kind of advice on someone as if you are overprotecting them. It's almost as if you are just helping a child to, say, learn how to read after they've asked you how this word is pronounced, or how does this topic go? I don't understand. Can you clarify it? And over time, when you constantly check up on them, there is a potential chance that maybe the child just wants to figure it out on its own.
Yeah, it's like trying to find the best method of actually teaching someone something. And the best method would be to just let them figure it out on their own instead of just giving them all the tools to fix their situation. You just let them find the tools that they need. Don't just hand it all over. Don't give a man a fish, you teach a man to fish kind of thing.
Right. Did any of you have any life examples based on this one rule?
Well, it kind of reminds me of a conversation I had this weekend with a buddy, just about politics in general. Like I don't know, I guess you could call him a bleeding heart liberal, and I'm fairly conservative. And we just kept arguing and disagreeing over everything. And then at one point, he's just like, you know what I just realized? We are having this like huge argument, like for the sake of argument's sake. Like there's no saltiness or anything involved, just like kind of playing devil's advocate for the most part. And he's just like, I kind of realized that most of the important issues we agree on. We don't agree on how to go about it, kind of thing. So like that's just the kind of thing you get from listening to someone in a conversation. Everything doesn't have to be a fight. It can just be a civil disagreement, especially about politics, because that's always so heated these days. Talking about Donald Trump or Justin Trudeau is bound to get anybody excited. Just listening to the other person is always going to be beneficial.
yeah, like I don't even touch political discussion anymore because people won't listen. Or worse, they will listen and you'll make a really good, profound point, and then they will just segue, just like hard left turn after you just monologued and explained your position and enlightened them to where you're at. And they have nothing to say to it. because they don't have a response, because they haven't thought about getting to a place where their opinion changes. And so having been cornered, they just start talking about sports. And so I've pretty much given up political conversation. And it's a shame, because I like listening to people who have like really fleshed out opinions, and I like
Yeah.
discussing and debating with individuals. And it doesn't happen. I have one friend that I can debate with, and he's not the greatest at it. Like, he's come a long way. I'm not very good myself, and that's probably half the problem.
Yeah,
And I've come a long way.
we don't have enough conversation partners. That's the thing. And that's another thing that I wanted to bring up with that example I just mentioned, cuz it was me and one other guy having this conversation, but it was in a room full of like 5 people, and the rest of them were saying, "Well, why are we talking about politics? We could just be talking about, the movie we just saw, or how Star Wars coming out soon, Magic the Gathering, whatever else we talk about." But like, no one else wants to have those conversations because they're not ready to listen, or they don't know how to listen properly.
And if you actually started having those conversations, you might get to a place where you realize that you're not actually completely useless, and that there is something you could contribute to society in a small part. And having those discussions would lead to growth and change. And I think that's very hard for many people to confront. I know it is for myself. I have a very hard time changing my opinion. Sometimes it takes a lot of effort for my wife to convince me of something that is so clearly true after she's convinced me, but I'm open to it, and she usually puts in the effort, and it gets us to a place of contentment. But for many people, it's just they're stuck in their ways.
I think the best way, and this is based on what I've learned from talking to so many people in my life, I think the best way to approach a new topic is to just bite off one chunk at a time instead of the whole thing. Just take one section of a topic and just kind of go over it for like a minute or two and see how your reaction is going to be. And sometimes it won't be right for you, but the important thing is to just pay attention to how you react and how much willingness are you going to put forth in the conversation. It could be kind of the same way when you're going on a blind date with somebody. You want to figure out, first of all, you know, what they do for a living. And then eventually, after a while, you get to ask them kind of personal questions like, what is your fondest memory? Or um, what is your biggest fear?
You don't get to know somebody by just talking. You have to actually listen to them and internalize what they're saying.
Or at the very least, try to spark something that is completely unusual for you to listen or for you to hear, actually. Something completely not expected. Like, you don't want to set your expectations too high over how the blind date is going to turn out, or how this event is going to be, or just a one-on-one session.
I liked one of the quotes nearer the end of this chapter, which was, "Takes a village to organize a mind."
Yeah, I had that one written down too.
I think like that ties back into what you were saying, Scott. We don't have conversation partners anymore. I don't know, when I was going through school, I don't think it was encouraged as much to just converse with people, to have regulated discussion. There was a debate team, like in my
Yeah.
peripherals. I'm certain I was aware of a debate team, but there was never a group exercise where the intention of the exercise was to make a solid point on opposing issues and play devil's advocate. Like, I feel like maybe there was a handful of those exercises in the 13 years of education, but in English class, we learned words maybe, and we never really played with words. And it's a shame. Like in math class, we played with numbers physically. We had toys that represented numbers, but in English class, we didn't do enough listening and speaking and conversing. And now in society, we don't have any of that. I mean, I spent the majority of my teen years into my 20s. All of my conversations were arguing at people over video games on the internet.
And I guess the other thing too is that sometimes, and I'm not saying all people do this, I'm saying some. There are some people who know what the conversation is, but are sometimes afraid to point out their opinion, or if there's something going on in their life that's ruining their day or their entire month or even a year or so, or just their overall lives, they are nervous about bringing it up, and they're constantly trying to find somebody who is willing to listen to them and then find some kind of guidance too. I'd say that's probably the hardest thing to find.
Yeah, it's
And
like there's a dichotomy there. Like, most people need to understand the importance of listening, but there's also the other extreme where they need to understand the importance of actually speaking up, because you don't sharpen your sword or your opinions by just listening to everybody. You have to actually put it into practice and actually try to argue for your own point of view.
It's like, on the one hand, we all know the saying, everyone's entitled to their own opinion. But on the opposite hand, we have an entire like group of people that don't share their opinion, that are afraid to express their opinion, that are shying away from the battle of conversation and truth because of some sort of existential force that has taught us that we shouldn't have an opinion, that we should be quiet, that we should stay out of the way and not disturb people, that people should be pleased by us, and that we should be nice. I don't know what it is.
It's not like we don't have a reason for it. Like, one of my favorite Jordan Peterson quotes is, "Yeah, it's dangerous to speak. Of course it is. That's never going to change. But it's way more dangerous not to speak, because then the truth just dies with you."
That's a really good quote, Scott.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes you'll even forget what the truth is.
Yeah.
There was this other little thing that I wrote down from this section. I don't have any context. My note-taking skills are slacking, but I have written converse philosophically as like the peak of the conversation pyramid. And then between conversing and listening is convincing, oppressing, dominating, and amusing. And I have no context for this, so eat up.
Well, some of those are quite negative, and some are not. So I would assume that conversing philosophically is what you want to do. Just like talking about subject matter instead of talking about people and opinions that come from certain people, so that's what makes them invalid. I guess what I'm trying to say there is it's easy to dismiss an idea because someone you don't like has said it, so you just attack it for that. Like, oh, now you're using conservative, right-wing, alt-right talking points for your argument.
It's the what if Hitler was a vegan trap.
Yeah.
And it's like, just because a bad person does a good thing doesn't make the good thing any less good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we can just, plant 20 million trees instead of just going to the UN and saying, "How dare you? How dare you say this?" And we're fighting the environment and everything with social justice when you could just plant a tree.
Let's not undermine someone's platform by saying just plant a tree. But
You're right.
let me share two things that came up in the news. So the word of the year from dictionary.com is existential. And it's been, after surveys and surveys, they've decided that existential is the word of the year that marks all of the crises we've gone through. I think Oxford's English Dictionary determined the word of the year was climate emergency.
Those are two words.
Precisely the first thought I had, but the juxtaposition of existential as the word of the year and climate emergency, it almost feels like they're kind of throwing blows at each other.
So one of them's liberal and the other's conservative, and that's what the conversation is going to denigrate into.
That first word, existential, it actually fits quite well, realistically. But then again, you know, everything can be existential in a good way.
I
You know what my
agree
word?
entirely.
You know what my word of the year is?
What?
Meaning.
Oh,
There you go.
It's a lot more optimistic than existential or crisis or whatever. How about we
Yeah.
talk about what we need instead of all the too much bullshit that we have?
well, I will call the CBC and let them know that Scott's word of the year is meaning.
Yes.
Hashtag meaning.
Report about
Let's
it
get it on
tomorrow.
Twitter.
Let's take a mid-roll break, though, boys. I think we should probably wrap up Rule 9 and move into Rule 10 after the break.
And we're back talking about Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And just as a side note, if you're new around here, you should check us out at bookwave.club. Without further ado, on to Rule 10. Be precise in your speech. What was your biggest takeaway from this one?
I wrote down a really good quote for this section. I'll pretend that this was my biggest takeaway. What you least want to encounter will make itself manifest when you are weakest and it is strongest, and you will be defeated.
I like that.
Yeah, when we often procrastinate so much and say, "Hey, I don't want to do these. I don't want to do this assignment. I don't want to pay my taxes right now.
I don't want to
I don't
shovel
wanna-
the snow.
Just let it all come by. It'll be no big deal." And then the next thing you know, it's going to get worse and everything. And you're like, what the hell?
Yeah, and so that ties into like the precision of your speech. And I think what is really being discussed is it ties in really well with the previous rule, and that's being entitled to your own opinion and actually speaking up about your darkest crap. And I think one of the things we missed in the last section was just how important it is not just to listen to others, but to actually listen to yourself and to dismiss the inner critic as thought and accept that critiquing yourself isn't listening to yourself. It isn't thinking highly. And you need to be precise in what you actually mean. If you aren't feeling satisfied or you don't feel life is meaningful enough, you need to meditate and you need to engage with yourself and see what is missing, because the sin of omission will destroy you.
It kind of ties into how optimistic or pessimistic we can become. Like, we do want to learn a lot of things, but sometimes we just want to put our foot forward first and say we are the smartest. Say, I'm the smartest person in the room. And it's always just that constant nagging in your head. Like, I want to be right on this. But then again, this one section is kind of boring. So I like to move on to something brand new and take on that.
Yeah, and it ties in with the same quote that I brought up twice already. If you have something to say, silence is a lie. So it's not just being precise in your speech, it's exactly that. It's speaking your being forward.
And the other quote that I have from near the end of this section is, if we speak carefully and precisely, we can sort things out and put them in their proper place and set a new goal and navigate to it, often communally, if we negotiate, if we reach consensus.
Yeah, because that's the overall goal, is just to reach a conclusion of how to solve a problem or about what the next destination is going to be. Just any of that.
I think that process takes a little bit more time than that quote suggests, though. Like, I've never been in a situation where I've had an argument or a discussion with someone and then my mind has been changed automatically. It usually alters bit by bit afterwards, just meditating on that conversation.
I think that has to do with personal strategies, because I think
Mm-hmm.
if you reflect, you'll probably realize that you've had many conversations where you thought one thing was one way and very quickly realized, no, indeed, it is not. But I think that gets beaten out of us at a very young age. At first we're learning to walk and we're learning what grass is and why we wear clothing, and we accept a lot of learning. And then we hit a point where we reject authority and knowledge, and we start to identify with our peer group, and we start to fall into these strategical mental processes that are traps. And I've definitely felt victim to them myself, but I think this is just part of human nature. You hit your teen years and you start to reject information. And some people never reassess that when they hit the adult years. They don't say, okay, it's time to accept authority again. It's time to accept lessons. It's time to grow more in a new way. And for a lot of people, that can manifest as just, no, you can't change my mind. I'm stubborn and I'm set in, and I'll only change my mind after I've reflected on what I've learned on my own. And there's nothing wrong with that because it's a predictable type. If it exists, then there can't be anything wrong with it. And I think that's a really great way to look at it.
I think that's just kind of how the brain works almost. I mean, I might be wrong, but I think there's something about our minds that, like, we can't have a conversation with someone and ourselves at the same time. Like, you can either be arguing for your point, or you can be like passively trying to learn. I don't think there isn't a middle ground. I think it's very difficult to reach both at the same time for a lot of people. And that's where meditation comes in.
Yeah, and so is mindfulness as well. Just
Yeah.
being aware of your thinking and your environment, which is always I think that's the first thing that you should take into account. Just understanding where you are now and asking yourself, are you here now?
It makes me think of the Socratic dialogues we've read, right? Because if Socrates had to meditate in between all these conversations to establish his opinion, he would have a very hard time changing his own views. And I think the reason he didn't have to meditate in the event that maybe he was wrong, which doesn't appear to happen very often in the dialogues, is he goes into the discussions with the belief and the knowledge that he doesn't know anything, and that he is aware intrinsically that he does not have the answers, but he has the capacity to question. And I think being able to go that route, and just the logic systems that he uses in his conversations. Like, if I were to show you 1 + 1 = 2, how could you not agree that 1 + 1 = 2 in that exact instant?
Yeah.
But I don't think people talk like that. I think that is the supreme excellence, and that middle place that you're talking about, Scott, is somewhere that not many of us get to.
Yeah, but like, just using that example, it only creates a conflict if you already have a predisposed opinion of what 2 + 2 is. Like, if I just don't know math and you tell me, oh, this is how math works, then I'm in a mode of complete and open learning. If I already have an opinion on, like, say, free trade versus communism, then it's a different story. Then you're not going to have a very likely transformation of opinion in that instance.
I don't think I'm trying to point out the likelihood of it happening. I'm more talking about the metaphor of, if you're discussing a topic and you think 1 + 1 = 3, and I prove to you that 1 + 1 = 2, how could you argue that? Like, if right, like,
Yeah.
hugely hypothetical. I don't know the likelihood of these conversations and topics and the genus and species of all of these different debates we could have. But if in this hypothetical uh, dream that we're having this conversation where you believe 1 + 1 = 3, and I show you that 1 + 1 = 2, I think anybody in that situation, if they have vision, should be able to say, yeah, I agree. That's how math works. I now
Yeah.
know, even though they went into it thinking 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah. I agree with you on that instance, but just to take it in a little bit of a different direction, I think a lot of these conversations are framed more like Plato's allegory of the cave, when both parties think they're coming back from the real world and telling someone in the cave a fact that they've learned, or this absolute truth that they know and nobody else knows, and the other person is just saying, oh, you're silly. That's not how it works. They're just shadows, don't you see? I think
Yeah,
both
so
sides
I hear
of a lot of arguments are claiming to be the enlightened being, whether they call themselves woke or red pilled or whatever. Most people see themselves as person that has already escaped the cave trying to communicate with someone else, and they don't assume that the other person knows something that they don't.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I applaud you in everything you've just, what precise speech you have uttered.
Why, thank you. I also like this one articulation that he brings up in this chapter where you only have three options in like a truly intense argument or whatever. Either slavery, tyranny, or negotiation. You're either going to win the argument by suppressing them, or you're going to lose it by giving up, or you're going to negotiate by both people giving in equal input of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that kind of ties back into those different modes of communicating, the oppressive speaker and the convincer. Instead of actually breathing and listening, truly listening and looking at each other in the face, I think a lot of these conversations that we're discussing uh, center around two people staring away from each other at the shadows reflected on the cave, and it's very hard for them to even just close their eyes and think about what they feel instead of looking at external evidence to determine the reality.
Yeah. Let's talk about Billy's Dragon for a little bit.
Well, Jordan Peterson brings up a children's story in the chapter. I forgot what the title is, but essentially it's about a boy who sees a dragon in his house. He's eating Billy's pancakes, he's eating Billy's shoes, his toys, and he keeps asking his mom, "Hey, mom, there's a dragon." And his mom is like, "Dragons don't exist. What are you talking about?" And then over time, the more things the dragon eats, the bigger it becomes, until eventually the dragon is so huge it eats Billy's house. It's gone. And then his dad shows up and asks, "What happened to the house? Where is it?" He even asks the mailman, "Hey, what happened to the house?" And then the mailman says, "Yeah, I think there was some large creature or something going about that way." And eventually, Billy's parents get together finally, and Billy brings it up again, like, "Dad, Mom, this dragon exists. Why didn't you see it?" And I forgot how it all ended, but I think it goes along the lines of, well, I didn't even know such a thing could happen like that.
Yeah, and once they identify the dragon, it starts to shrink. And I think it speaks to the notion that the more you neglect your problems, the bigger they get until you have to confront them. And in the situation of Billy's house and his mother refusing to accept that there was a dragon, the dragon walked off with the house. And it wasn't until she said, "Oh, okay, I see the dragon," that it
That
started.
the dragon wasn't big enough to take the house until you neglected it for long enough for it to grow that big.
Indeed.
Yeah. And the lesson there is just to properly identify all your problems and your goals to properly navigate the fog of uncertainty.
Yes, and also it can be, it's a driving force. It'll actually get you up in the morning and actually think about how you want to plan the day and how much stuff you want to get done. And in a way, I kind of imagine, whenever I hear this story, I kind of imagine that there's an apocalypse happening that's going to occur sometime soon. And if I had this amount of time to live, what would I do in that time? I think we can all say, maybe I want to tell this person how much I love them, or maybe I want to travel to Argentina or go to England for a vacation or visit the Mayan ruins or start a business, whatever that might do. You always have this drive to do something instead of just wanting to just sit back and say, "It's no big deal." But we do that. In fact, I think within this kind of conversation, there were times where I wanted to actually sit back and wonder, are there going to be bad things along the way? And of course, it's not that healthy to just think about the future all the time. But every once in a while, when there are actually occurrences that deeply disturb you, you always wonder how well this is going to affect me if I let this occurrence take hold of me. And so, I was one of those people who would worry about what's happening in the news and what our current government is doing, particularly here in the States. The possibility of a civil war happening, a second civil war, or just high rising taxes or high rising rent and apartments and houses and everything like that. And then I think about the purpose that I am particularly fond of, which is storytelling, and how I can put my novel, my stories out to the publishing industry before this occurrence, whatever it might be, blocks me from preventing my goal. I don't know if you two have that similar frame of mind, but that's what kind of affected me sometime a few years ago and a little bit of it today.
Yeah, I mean, we don't really have the existential threat of a civil war, but I've definitely been overly consumed by the news in the past. And it
It's an
just,
easy trap to fall into,
yeah.
the fear mongering of the news. Like, so this morning I was listening to the news, and there's some sort of gathering of nations that's going on, and they said over 200 countries have representatives at this gathering. And my first thought is 200 countries, but there's only 5 countries that we talk about in the news, or maybe 10, right? You've got Canada, sometimes kind of, America, England, China, Japan, Russia, and then you're already into like secondary characters by that point. So the fact that there's 200 countries, but there's only so much news, and it's all fear based for the bulk of it. And every now and then, it sneaks up on you, and you're wrapped up in a news story like the impeachment or the shootings, and it sort of completely changes your reality, and puts this sort of lens of dread and fear and existential crisis on everything, when in reality the biggest problem that's affecting my hometown is people still don't like the lane changes on one of the major streets. They've congested the lanes down to 2.5 lanes, and that's the biggest problem. There's no terrorist attacks, there's no impeachment, there's no government scandal. We've got a drug addiction problem, but that's just sort of a baseline for the country. And when you get wrapped up in these things, it doesn't solve the problems, but the news has been crafted to wrap us up in it. But never at the end of a news story do they say, and if you want to help, this is the 3 different things you could do today. And it's a weird system.
Yeah, that last point that you brought up is just so important. Like, not only do they focus on the stories that the everyday person has no control over, they also don't give you any clues or hints on how to help in the little ways that you can.
The only time the CBC News asks for viewership response is when they're clutching their pearls, trying to find people that agree with how freaked out they should be by the fact that the prime minister blackfaced 10 years ago. And it's like just freaking ridiculous.
Yeah, don't forget about Don Cherry, but that's for another day.
Well, it's just like when they actually call on you, the whole man on the street interview. The last time I heard the man on the street interview was with Justin Trudeau's blackfacing. And it's like, so you've got people calling in and they're like, I'm very upset that he did this thing that has no impact on climate change or the wage gap or inequality between races. But let me tell you, this is bad.
Yeah.
And I guess that's pretty much brings us to the main point of this rule, is that do we truly understand what we are saying? And oftentimes we don't even realize what we are saying. We just speak automatically as if it's something that we are required to do. And when we don't have enough information to gather, we often just automatically pick a setting and just run with it. But if we learn to figure out what we are saying, what we're going to say, take the time to actually think about it, there's going to be enough breathing room and narrow down any potential outcomes that might occur or deviate from achieving a goal or something.
Mm-hmm. And just to answer my own question from the start of this video, what was our biggest impact? There was one line from this chapter that definitely had an impact on me when I read it. And it was just one short, pretty meaningless sentence that just said, maybe your relationship is ending because you are a bad person. That gave me like PTSD flashbacks.
Oh no.
But like in the most productive way, not to undermine anybody's PTSD. I just had one of those moments, like
It's a punch in the gut.
yeah, exactly.
There was one other quote that kind of goes on that same thread. Maybe what you need, what you deserve, after all, is someone exactly as imperfect as you.
Mm-hmm. And that could be
Those two-
taken so many different ways. Like, either you deserve to be with a piece of garbage because you're a piece of garbage, or you don't deserve to be with someone who respects you until you respect yourself.
That takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, I'm still working on it myself, so I agree with you there.
Oh, absolutely. Any closing remarks?
Confront the dragon, get the gold, share it with the community.
If you truly want progress to occur, think about what others say about progress, what their version is, and just learn to, it's a bit of an over exaggeration and we keep repeating it, but just listen to what the other side has to offer. Because that's the thing. You can not only negotiate with somebody, but you can negotiate the future. That's the best part. And by having an open mind, there is endless possibilities. You just have to figure out what to say in order to achieve it.
Well, I will continue to work on listening to others and being precise in my speech. Check us out at bookwave.club. And until next time, my name is Will. Have a great day.
And may the force be with you.